Hi, I'm EAC Commissioner Ben Hovland. For today's interview for Women's History Month, I'm honored to be speaking with Oregon Secretary of State, Shemia Fagan. Thank you, Secretary, for joining us. Secretary Fagan has held a variety of positions from school board member to state legislator, and in 2020 was elected as the Secretary of State of Oregon. Thank you for speaking with me today and contributing to the EAC's recognition of Women's History Month. To start off, can you tell us a little bit more about your career in public service and really whether you've had any women who were mentors or role models that stand out, and you could share a little bit about that?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to join you, Commissioner, and it's great to be celebrating Women's History Month here in Oregon. And, my public service really was born out of wanting to help families that struggled, like my family struggled, or at least that, struggled. My family, I grew up actually raised by a single dad, which is unusual then. It was unusual 40 years ago. It's very unusual still today. My dad was a single parent. I have two older brothers. So I grew up in rural Oregon, a small town of about 600 people, eventually moved to the bright lights and big city of a town of about, 10,000 people. And so grew up in small towns with a single parent and grew up in a house full of boys. And so certainly women role models were really, really important in my life, including my mom, honestly, who she struggled with addiction for most of my life and homelessness. But she was just this extraordinary person that, when she was with us, she just had this ability to just make other people always feel engaged. She was kind of a life of the party type. And, I watched her struggle and saw the person that she was, and I saw how other people saw her and treated her, particularly when she was experiencing addiction or homelessness. And, once went to visit her with one of my older brothers when I was about 15, drove us from our Eastern Oregon, rural Oregon community to Portland, Oregon, and hadn't seen her in a couple of years. And we went to visit her. She kind of gave us an address, pulled up, saw this amazing house with a big porch. And she actually walked us underneath the porch and kind of crawled on all fours because that's where she was living at the time. And so, my mom watching her struggles, it's kind of even though it might be an unexpected role model, just, knowing who she was as a person and how loving and smart and funny, she was so funny, that she was, but also knowing how people saw her was really impactful to me. And to know that there are a lot of folks out there, whether they're, battling addiction or a mental health crisis or just struggling in one way or another, that, there's somebody's mom, there's somebody's uncle, there's somebody's sibling or child, and to really see people through kind of the struggles that they had. So I would really identify my mom as one of my early role models, just the way that I got to experience her. And so, my service started on a school board, David Douglas School Board, kind of a metro suburban district out here in Portland, Oregon, serving a lot of low-income kids. Education played a really, really big role in my life. As I mentioned, my family really struggled. And so that ability to give back to, as I say, if you climb up the ladder and you get to a different place in life, you don't kick it out. You turn around and you hold it steady for that next group of people that are coming through. And so that's really what I've tried to do with my public service is really to see the folks that are not, who needs my power, right? There's a lot of power in politics, already established systematic power, who needs power that I can help be empowered, to make a positive difference in people's lives here in Oregon.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. It's, I think you're right that, looking at these things from so many different angles and really how we can, use these roles, use these jobs to help people is so important. Obviously at the Election Assistance Commission and you working at the Secretary of State or being the Secretary of State in Oregon, elections is a big part of the job. For us, 2022 marks the 20th anniversary of the signing of the Help America Vote Act. And throughout the year, the EAC will be reflecting on how much things in elections have changed, how that law has helped people to participate in the process, help people vote. You've served as a secretary during a very interesting and challenging time for election officials, unfortunately. From your experience as a legislator and as a secretary, can you share some of the changes that you've seen in elections?
Well, first off, congratulations to, Hava, the 20-year anniversary. That's exciting coming up. Means you're still a little bit younger than vote by mail in Oregon, because we've been doing it since 1998. But I've only been secretary for a year, but I had the pleasure of serving in the Oregon legislature since 2013 in the House and the Senate. And one of the landmark bills that we helped pass is, while Oregon was first in the nation vote by mail back in 1998, we were also first in the nation to pass what we call automatic voter registration, or opt-out voter registration, right? We took the reality. Our then Secretary of State, now Governor Kate Brown, said, wait a second, if when someone registers and then we go check DMV to verify their information, DMV already knows who's eligible to vote. Why don't we just register everybody who's eligible unless they ask not to be registered, unless they opt out? Which we're happy to see that spread across many, many states now, supported by Republicans and Democrats, because just to give people that voice, to not make it so hard for them to exercise our most basic political right, the right to vote. So very proud of what we have here in Oregon as really the gold standard in voter registration, and just making it easy for people to vote. Commissioner, when I was running for Secretary of State in 2020, and there was obviously a lot of people experiencing vote by mail for the first time because of states expanding access to what they call absentee, we call vote by mail, because of the pandemic. And so I would be on calls with national organizations sometimes, and they would say, wow, you're from Oregon? What's it like to be from the state that created vote by mail? And I would say, well, until recently, it's the most boring topic in Oregon politics. It has worked so well for so long. We don't really even think about it. We know it's secure, paper ballots, post-election audits. So we have a really extraordinary election system here in Oregon. We can always do better. We're trying to make sure, that we do things like restoring the right to vote for folks who are incarcerated, to join a couple other states that do that, to get the same day voter registration, so that people, who maybe aren't exactly following closely elections, 20 or so days before an election, still have a chance to vote for their preferred candidates. And so, we're really doing a lot here in Oregon, but we never sit back on our laurels and think, okay, cool, we've done the good thing. We're always going to try to lead the nation in voter access and secure, trustworthy elections.
Absolutely. And as a former Oregonian myself, I can say that my experience with the Oregon vote by mail system was fantastic. Always enjoyed it. And, I think, one of the things that you just hit on there, the way that we see, or when you're working at the AC or working at the national level, you see this 50 state vantage point, and you see the ways that states like Oregon are innovators, and they go out and they try these things, and then it moves to other states, and certainly, as you said, it paid huge dividends during the pandemic, watching other states have to ramp up more quickly without the time that an Oregon or a Washington had to sort of ramp up their vote by mail. And as you mentioned, the automatic registration, again, another way that Oregon's been a leader. And so with that pressure, since taking office in 2021, what are some of the initiatives that you're looking at, to implement during your time and going forward? What's going to be the next great thing coming out of Oregon?
Well, the foundation of a functioning democracy, right, is the nonpartisan professionals who want to do that work. And as I'm sure you're well aware, we have we're going to have kind of the great resignation across the country of professional elections workers because of threats that they faced and people who question their integrity. And we surveyed our own election division staff at the Secretary of State's office, as well as our county clerks. We have county clerks in 36 Oregon counties, all 36 counties who run those elections in that decentralized way. And they've received more calls of harassment, more threats than ever before. And so our priority for this most recent legislative session was the Election Workers Safety Act, to really draw attention to and increase the penalties and fines and criminalize threatening election workers and harassing election workers, because we need people to actually do this work. We need people, I'm the elected Secretary of State. I don't hand out ballots and I don't count ballots, right? I help run and make sure that our laws are actually administered in a uniform, equitable, objective way. But it's our county clerks and our professional election workers who are out there making sure that everybody who's eligible gets that ballot, and that everybody whose ballot is returned gets counted counted accurately. And the dearth of election workers is something that we're going to be really facing here in Oregon and across the country. And we need people to step up and do that work. I mean, it's hard when they're thinking about having to face threats of harassment or potentially actually, threats to their safety and their family's safety. And that's something that we're going to really struggle with. So we put forward the Protect the Election Worker Safety Act. And I also just want to acknowledge that when I've been going around, my goal is to visit all 36 Oregon counties. I would have hoped to have done it by now, but this thing called a global pandemic has made that a little bit challenging. But we've certainly obviously talked with all of our clerks virtually, but we're now out trying to make sure that we get into even the smallest counties in Oregon. And you know what? They all have been very grateful for HAVA funds over the last 20 years. They've showed me equipment that they were able to purchase to modernize and to make sure they can efficiently and securely administer elections from our smallest counties to our largest. I'm really appreciative of the Help America Vote Act and the funding. It's too often that people, see rules and regulations come down on how public services have to operate, often regulations that are important and need to happen, but they don't come with any funding. And it's really hard when you say, do this, but you don't actually provide the funding to either buy the equipment or the technology or hire the people to get that done. And I just want to say how grateful we are here in Oregon to HAVA to not only, to require certain policies for standards for election access and security in the US, but to provide the dollars to actually make that happen. That's really, really huge. And I can tell you from our smallest counties to our largest counties here in Oregon, we're very grateful for the Help America Vote Act.
Yeah, we love to give it out whenever Congress chooses to, and you hit on a couple really important things there in the threats and the harassment that election offices have been receiving, and certainly that's a stress, and we know resources are always a stress because unfortunately elections are underfunded, and I just keep thinking that with more investment into our elections, one of the things that I think too often falls to the back burner is that voter education piece and helping people understand the process. And I think that is part of why we're seeing the threats and the harassment is just, there's a lot of people that unfortunately don't understand how all this works. But we are, obviously doing our best to explain it, and particularly back in a federal election year. We got the 2022 midterms coming up. And as you look out, at this year, what are some of the notable changes that you'd like to see in elections?
Well, we need to rebuild trust in our elections. I mean, as you mentioned, it's really, people out there. Now, there's some folks, whether it's here at home, people spreading false information or, foreign adversaries trying to mess with and make democracy look bad. That spreading of false information has had a huge impact on our elections and on people's trust in the system. And so we're really focused in the 2022 cycle, in addition to obviously election security and protecting our frontline election workers, we're really focused on using our communications to pre-bunk instead of always waiting to debunk, but to pre-bunk false information that's out there about our elections. And, for example, here in Oregon, this will be the first election this May, other than a small county election that happened a few months ago. This will be the first statewide election where we allow ballots that are postmarked by election day to be counted, even if they arrive a day or two or three by mail in the county elections office. We know that they were signed, sealed, delivered, cast by election day. And that's what really matters, right? You can't have somebody casting a ballot the day after election day, but if they cast it by putting that in the United States Postal Service, and then the post office driver, delivers it to the county election office a few days later, of course, it was cast on time, just like a ballot put in a drop box 2 weeks earlier, right? As long as it's cast by election day. So we're doing a lot of communication to get ahead of the false information that we expect. Doing some PSAs, working with our county clerks, translating those PSAs into multiple languages. So we reach as many communities as possible, getting ahead of information saying, hey, postmark your ballot by election day, or put it in a drop box like you always have, no problem, but really trying to drive home that message that whether the ballot arrives to the county clerk's office by election day or a few days later by mail, it was cast on time. And we obviously look, Commissioner, there are folks who believe that the earth is flat, right? We're never going to convince everybody. There are folks out there who are going to be very, very committed to spreading conspiracy theories, but they're not our target audience. Our target audience is the folks that are very capable and willing to believe accurate, trusted sources if we can get that information to them and make sure they don't just see something from, somebody saying something nefarious and false about our elections and being persuaded. So we're trying to get some voter education out there in some fun, memorable ways using advertising companies and PSAs to get that information out there in advance and say, hey, look, even if it takes a few days for that ballot to arrive by mail, it was cast on time. It was sealed and delivered before any results came out, before 8 p.m. on election day. They cast their ballot on time and really trying to get ahead of that. So we're really focused on pre-bunking. And of course, if something comes up, also debunking false information so we can rebuild that trust in our elections, both here in Oregon, but also across the country.
Absolutely. Certainly, I think that's going to be important this year. And one of the things that, is a challenge that election officials are facing across the country. And certainly, when you look at folks across the country, one of the things that we consistently see is so many of the great people that are working in elections, the dedicated public servants that help make our democracy work. What advice would you have, as a woman in elections, would you have for any other women who are interested in a career in elections or public service?
Yeah. I would say that this job is not to be a martyr, right? You don't have to just you don't have to take abuse. You don't have to take harassment. If people are mistreating you, report it. We report any kind of complaints from our county clerks to the FBI, to law enforcement, right? This is not a job where you say, oh, I'm just doing my job and they can say what they want to say. No, particularly as a woman, if you're getting harassment, if you feel unsafe, this is not a job to be like, oh, I'll take it, I'm tough. You can be as tough as you want to be, but let's speak out and make sure that if you feel threatened, if you're getting harassed, to notify your Secretary of State, your local law enforcement, and have those people held accountable, and have them, make sure that they don't do that to the next election worker that comes along. So really, I think the idea is, you can have the thickest skin in the world. I don't care if people criticize me or say they don't like me or they don't like how I look or whatever. That stuff doesn't bother me. But when they're criticizing our professional election workers and the work they do, I don't care how thick your skin is, report it, right? Call those people out and make sure that, because most people out there don't want to harass election workers. It's of course a very, very narrow set of people that are out there, harassing election workers, school board members, and they deserve to be held accountable so that the rest of us can feel safe, and the rest of us can feel safe engaging in controversial political dialogue, which is part of a healthy democracy, without having to cross that line into harassment or threats.
Absolutely. I say probably too much. I think probably some of our staff is tired of hearing me say it, but the good election administration is really just about good governance and customer service. And in my experience, that's what election administrators are looking to do. And certainly, the job description doesn't say that you have to put up with that. And so you're absolutely right that those types of things should be reported, and really, be able to focus on the great parts of the job, which are helping people to participate in our democracy and helping, average Americans make their voice heard, which, is an awesome job. Well, I'd like to thank you, Secretary, for speaking with me and sharing your insight on elections in Oregon. Best of luck administering your elections this year, and the EAC looks forward to working with you in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thanks for celebrating Women's History Month.